reaction, at least to what we're hearing in the Capitol. Obviously, I'm still optimistic. The responses I've gotten thus far is it looks like there's appears to be not enough votes. Obviously, a lot of things can change. Having served in the legislature, I know that the only thing predictable is unpredictability of the legislature, and so we'll watch and see. But clearly, for the taxpayers, it's important that we, going into this next year, the remainder of the fiscal year we're in right now, on January 3rd and beyond, have all options available to us to balance the current fiscal challenges that the state faces that are exceeding potentially $150 million or more for the current fiscal year, as well as have the ability to make some long-term changes that could help us balance the $3.3 billion that the state of Wisconsin faces in terms of a deficit for the next biennial budget. And as I've said all along, it's my hope that we have as many options on the table as possible. That certainly means for us having the ability to come back and discuss future wage and benefit reforms in this current fiscal year, which will continue from January through the end of June 30th, 2011, and then in many cases be things potentially that could open the door for some long-term changes in the next biennial budget. Had the contracts been approved today or at some point in the future, obviously that does more to box us in, and that reduces the amount of options we have on the table. Certainly, if the shortfall as projected continues, the $150 million or more, that means that other things rise up higher on the list, whether it's layoffs or furloughs or even reductions in other essential state programs such as those funded by Medicaid and other related programs. Those are certainly tough choices, and we'd like to have as many options on the table as possible. In particular, when you look at options such as layoffs in this climate, really for me, one of the last options I want to have to consider is having any more people in the state not employed. And so it's a much preferable option to be able to consider wage and benefit reforms or other things that would balance the budget without having people laid off. And certainly I'm hopeful as this day continues, that's one of the options I have available to me as opposed to some of those other more difficult options. So with that, I guess that's just a quick reaction. The only other thing I'd just say, and then I'll open up some questions, is let me be clear. I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. This is about wage and benefit reform and balancing the budget. I have the utmost respect for people who work in public service, in this case in state government. I respect state and state and local government workers, and think the vast majority of people in public service do a good job. And so this is not about whether or not we think people are doing a good job. It's ultimately about making sure we have every option on the table to avoid some of the tougher choices that I don't think anybody really wants now or in the future. So I just want to be clear. I think the vast majority of people who work in state and local government are doing a good job and are good people, and certainly respect that, but know that we've got to have every option on the table. With that, I'll take some questions.
You mentioned the possibility of additional furloughs if these contracts go through, but aren't you locked in by the number of furloughs you can do? To what extent would you have the ability to add?
Yeah, right now we don't have a plan on the table. I just know, obviously looking at my current role over the last 8 years as county executive, that's one option we've used as a last-ditch measure. Obviously, the state's used that in the past. It certainly would be my preference, and legally we'd have to figure out ways we could invoke that if needed. But I've always tried to look for options as alternatives to layoffs. Again, at a time when the economy's tough, the last thing I want is anybody, be they in the public sector or the private sector, laid off from a position. And so I'm going to look for as many options as possible, which is, again, why I've stressed so much that I don't want these contracts approved, because I need to have every option available. And to me, wage and benefit reforms, wage and benefit reforms, as well as alternatively furloughs, if we could do them, would be a much better option than layoffs.
Representative Fitzgerald seemed to indicate that if these changes were passed and approved, that it would put the unions on solid footing to try and wait out your term, so to speak, and hopefully wait for the next election to get a better deal and just not have any new contracts. How much of a change are these from the old contracts that they're under currently, And how much would that change things if they actually got on this new one?
Well, it certainly has an impact in terms of the remainder of this year. What you've got is, and if you've heard proponents of the plan talking about, that been out without a contract essentially for 18 months, this is about finishing out this biennial budget process that we're currently in. Certainly would have an impact on balancing the $150 million or so that we face in the current fiscal year. But I don't think it permanently locks us out of decisions we need to make for the next biennial budget. And as I mentioned about a week ago, certainly we've looked at any number of reforms, from specific collective bargaining changes in the statutes to an outright repeal of the state law that allows for public unions to be established in the first place in this state, and everything in between. And so we're going to look at every option out there. We don't have a specific plan yet. Part of it's waiting to see what happens, and part of it's once I get in office on January 3rd, to see what sort of reforms we can negotiate short of that type of a change. But we're going to look at every option out there. I mean, in the end, we've got to balance this budget. The people of the state, the taxpayers certainly want it, and I think the people who are concerned about core public services want to make sure we do that as well.
What have you heard about the number of votes for these in either the Senate or the Assembly at this point?
Probably the same things you all have. A couple staff members, passed on things. I haven't been doing a head count or anything in that regard. Haven't been, for us, this was about getting our message out. I mean, it's a little bit of an unusual circumstance because not being the governor currently, for me, I really have the power of this, the bully pulpit. And so I haven't been, going through and systematically calling one lawmaker after another. I've been trying to make our case, make the argument to members of both political parties. I think those who care about the future of the state that we need to have all options on the table because, again, next year, even with new majorities in place, Democrat and Republican alike, we're going to have to make some tough choices. And for those that are going to work with us to balance the next state budget, I think they care about that. And that's why I've said it repeatedly. But in terms of the count, obviously I hear there's concerns about passage, but I don't have a good head count. We haven't established anyone from my office to specifically count heads.
What do you think about the news that Representative Jeff Wood has been released from jail today to come down to vote on this and potentially could be a deciding vote one way or the other on this?
The legislature's an interesting place. To me, again, I'm going to look at the outcome, not look at specific individuals.
For those Democrats that may be concerned, why do you think they might be doing that? I mean, they're probably not trying to look for your best interests and trying to help you, but are they just worried politically about the impact if their votes associated? We've heard that it's maybe some that got defeated in November who are concerned. Why would they not want to pass this?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. And I don't think it's limited to that. I've mentioned, for example, for the past couple of weeks when I've been on the radio, I've mentioned not only folks who were in seats where they were defeated, but, for example, someone like Tim Carpenter, state senator from the south side of Milwaukee. I've known Tim for years. I served with him in the state assembly. I found him to be a fairly independent person on issues like this, and a guy who, right or wrong on the issue, does a lot of doors and tends to react to that. As you might recall in the past, he was one of the few Democrats that voted for the property tax freeze. He voted for voter ID. In each of those cases, those are clearly things he voted on because he heard that when he went door to door. And my sense was if he was hearing from enough people on this issue, someone like him, whether it was him or someone else like him in either the Assembly or the Senate, those would be the type of lawmakers who, regardless of party, might be interested in voting no, saying this is not the time to pass these. Whether or not that's effective or not, obviously the vote, if they have a vote in both chambers, will be up in the air. I think if you're a Democrat, besides the fact that I think there are a lot of lawmakers, regardless of party, who just care first and foremost about the state, and certainly the state's in a fiscal challenge right now. But the other practical issue is for state workers is if you're taking off an option off the table, and if one of the ultimate options to balance this budget is layoffs, I would think for a lot of lawmakers, they view that for their potential constituents who might be affected by that as a much more damning prospect than the option of not having contracts and coming back and negotiating fairly modest contributions for a pension and for health care. Again, when you look at what we laid out on the table just as an example, and I'm not negotiating this, so the things I bring out are purely examples, but over the 6 months remaining of this fiscal year, from January to June 30th, if we were to ask state employees to make a 5% contribution to the pension system and a 12% contribution for their health care premium, that would generate $154 million all funds. Obviously, that goes a long way towards balancing that projected budget deficit for the remainder of this fiscal year. I think most workers outside of government look at that and say 5% and 12% for health care, that's a deal. Most people out there look at that, including probably many of you in your own companies that you work for in media, would say 12% for health care. That's not bad. That's pretty generous. There's a lot of workers out across the state who say, hey, I pay anywhere from 25 to 50% of the premiums for my health care, and if I get a retirement system, I'm paying a whole lot more than 5%. So I don't think what we've put out as an example of the sort of reforms we might be interested in the future are things that the average taxpayer, the average worker in this state would find to be particularly outrageous. My hope would be, again, going back to your question, is for those lawmakers, regardless of party, who are looking at how to vote on this, they'd understand both the concern about the potential for layoffs combined with the fact that the reforms that we might be negotiating for in the future are really pretty generous compared to where most workers are here in the state of Wisconsin.
We have time for one more question.
What would be the prospects for the unions to actually reach accord with the state if these current contracts aren't passed with these newer, larger kind of give-backs?
Well, timing-wise, certainly I can't start till January 3rd, but at that point, with our head of employee relations and with the negotiating team, we would bring people in and talk to each of the respective collective bargaining units and start talking about what we think the state could afford and what options there might be. I gave the two examples, but that's not, certainly wouldn't be my final offer or my only offer on behalf of the state. I think we'd want to lay out a series of options and say, here's what we need to balance not only this budget but current or future budgets. What alternatives do you have to that? Again, we're not wed to a specific amount. We just know we have to balance the budget. And I think if we're going to make those sorts of reforms for the next biennial budget, it obviously makes some sense to try and get those changes in place for the remainder of this fiscal year if there are things that are going to be teed up to help us in the next biennial budget as well.
Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks.